All right. This is your Gaza War Sit Rep day 158. And any fake ceasefire news you may have heard to the contrary, there is no end in sight. I have a number of things today. It's been 2 days since the last sit rep, so there's 2 days worth of news from the fronts. I want to break down another phrase. I might end up doing this regularly, but there's a phrase that I've been hearing from the anti-war, anti-genocide kind of side that I want to break down, and and then I want to do a little bit of a history dive into Jordan, just like we've done Syria, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority. I want to also do Jordan now, just to give you a sense of how Jordan came to play the role that it's playing in the conflict today. So, first of all, the news from the fronts, and let's start with Yemen, because Ansar Allah in Yemen has struck another another U.S. Ship. They hit the American ship called Pinocchio in the Red Sea with a number of anti-ship missiles. And there is also, as I said in the previous sit rep, we've always got to report not just what Ansar Allah does, but also what they say, because one of the Houthi leaders the other day, I think it was yesterday, it might have been today, said to the Arab countries that are participating in airdrops of food, what you need to do is airdrop weapons over occupied Palestine. Airdrop them weapons so that they can use to defend themselves if you really want to make a contribution. So again, they always can be relied upon to say stunning things. Speaking of stunning things, just as an aside, apparently one of the vice presidents of Columbia University was asked, "Are Palestinians human or not?" And he couldn't bring himself to answer. He said something like, "I refuse to be intimidated," or something. So apparently, it's intimidation to ask if Palestinians are human beings. So there you go. Now, Iraq today. At the other one from the front, Iraq hit the Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv with a drone. So Tel Aviv Airport hit from Iraq with a drone. So again, long range. These weapons are hitting from very long range. That's Iraq, and that's Yemen. And then we have Hezbollah. Many attacks on the Hezbollah front, and Israel also hitting Lebanon as well. Hezbollah hit Jal al-Alam. They attacked the air defense barracks in Kila, gatherings of soldiers in Al-Tayhat and Al-Rahib. Hit an Israeli drone, forced an Israeli drone to retreat, targeted positions in Khirbet Ma'ar, Al-Samaka, and Kafar Shuba, and a group of Israeli soldiers while they're installing new espionage equipment at Al-Marj. Hezbollah also, that was yesterday. Today there were 13 different operations, shelling Kila barracks again, targeting Rahib with Burkan rockets, spy equipment at Birkat Risha, spy equipment at Jal al-Alam, Al-Jarda, Hadab Yarin, Birkat Risha, Ruwaysat al-Alam, Zebedin, and Shaba Farms, Brannet Barracks. So lots of barracks hit with Burkan rockets. This is, as usual, from REJARYJEAY on Twitter. So the Hezbollah front is very active. By the way, I should mention that both Ansar Allah in Yemen and the Iraqi resistance reported that their intention is to escalate their operations as the famine in Gaza intensifies until they get what they want, which is a ceasefire, an ending of the aggression on Gaza civilians, and a starvation war against Gaza. So, West Bank, we mentioned in the previous sitrep that Tulkarm, there was a major explosion of a bulldozer in Tulkarm. It seems like the same kind of thing is happening in Jenin now. Major clashes between the resistance in Jenin in the West Bank, Northwest Bank, and including some fairly big improvised explosive devices against bulldozers. So the West Bank is also a very active front of military activity. Now we go to Gaza. So Gaza, we have fighting, shelling. Yesterday we had shelling with mortar shells south of Gaza City. Some fighting in Zaytun neighborhood, which we've mentioned, fighting and shelling clashes inside Gaza, and a lot of fighting in Khan Yunis. So in Khan Yunis, we have had, including today, infantry forces ambushed at point blank range, hit Merkava tank, hit 2 anti-personnel mines in Hamad city north of Khan Yunis. These are Qassam brigades. Then there's Saraya al-Quds also hitting a D9 bulldozer, military vehicle, explosive device consisting of 6 infantry, shelling infantry in Khan Yunis. So all fighting, a lot of fighting in Khan Yunis over the past 2 days. Detonated a rigged building, detonated a pre-rigged tunnel in Al-Qarara. Al-Qarara being, let me find Al-Qarara on a map. Show you. Sorry, people. Apologies. Let me just make sure. I think Al-Qarara is in central Gaza. I want to make sure. Yep, north of Khan Yunis, just like I thought. So on Google Maps, just to show you briefly for a second. Here's the Gaza Strip. Here's Khan Yunis, and here's Al-Qarara. So the fighting right now between the Palestinian resistance factions and the Israelis is in Khan Yunis. And as they have been doing every single day since the ground war started, they've been destroying military vehicles, armored bulldozers, and ambushing and hitting infantry forces, whether they're in their tents or holed up in buildings or in static positions. So, okay. One other thing, which is that I can't verify this, but I did see some video of construction equipment, concrete blocks and construction machinery, and it's like all in a lineup. So, and I don't know the landscape well enough to be able to tell if this is Rafah, but the video was saying, the text accompanying the video was saying, this is construction equipment that the U.S. is sending into Gaza to build this pier. So it looks like the pier is happening. And people were saying, while the actual humanitarian aid trucks are not allowed to go in from Rafah, this construction equipment has been expedited so that the pier could be built. This pier remains a mystery. You probably have seen the article that's in the Israeli media that says the pier was Netanyahu's idea, and all the benefits of the pier, which include sidelining UNRWA, softening Israel's image problem, making Israel not responsible for aid into Gaza. So this is all of these stated reasons are preposterous. Israel doesn't care about its image problem. Israel's celebrating the starvation of Gaza. Israel, it's true that if the United States were to take over aid distribution via this pier, they could sideline UNRWA, the United Nations agency. But is the UNRWA exists, it kind of misunderstands why UNRWA exists. UNRWA exists to be humiliated by the Israelis. The United States military is not going to fulfill that role. They're not going to take as well to being constantly humiliated by the Israelis the way that the United Nations bureaucracy is meekly accepts that position. And the United States and Israel have a lot in common. And one of the things they have in common is their militaries don't agree to being part of any alliance that isn't under their control. So the Americans never accept being part of any military alliance or operation that they're not in command of. And the Israelis are the same. So who's going to be in command of this pier? It's the Israeli interest in occupying and genociding Gaza. But the Americans never accept being under anyone's direct military command. So this brilliant brainchild still has a lot of details that are presumably going to be worked out while starvation continues to intensify over the next 2 months. So there's just the article explaining that it was Netanyahu's idea doesn't begin to answer the many questions that arise from this notion. I think I'll leave the pier for now. Maybe there will be more details that emerge in the coming days. Now, this phrase that I wanted to unpack before we do our history of Jordan and Black September in particular, the phrase that I want to unpack is the phrase that you've all heard many times. The US could end this war with one phone call. Anytime they could stop their supply to Israel and end the war. And I've said this, we've talked about this a little bit because this is how all of the previous rounds of war against Gaza, the so-called Israeli what Israel calls mowing the lawn, all of the previous wars since 2005, whether it was 2006, 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, 2018, 2021, all of these wars, Israel murdered people for weeks, and then the Americans told them to stop. So what's different now? And we don't know. We know that it is different. It's hard to determine why, and that's why I think we're stuck. We're getting analytically stuck in the old way that it used to work. We are analytically stuck in the idea that Israel perhaps radically overvalues the lives of Israelis. We know that they radically devalue. We know that they continue to radically devalue and dehumanize and be racist against Palestinians and everybody else that isn't Israeli, Jewish Israeli. But I think based on the way the Israeli hostages have been managed, I think it's increasingly the case that Israel does not structurally overvalue, Israeli society does not structurally overvalue the lives of Israeli Jews even, including military hostages, because they have made a decision to let all the hostages die, and indeed to kill them themselves. So that is a major change. We've discussed it's going to have major implications, but in the short term, we have to adapt our understanding of what's going on based on that. And similarly, the idea that the US could stop it in an instant and is not stopping it, we have to understand that it is not stopping it. And whatever the implications are of the fact that whether that means that it can and it chooses not to, or that it can't anymore, we have to deal with that fact. And so what does it mean that the US is not stopping it and will not be stopping it? And I think the reason, I think if you want to just try to understand it analytically, you know, we all know about the power of the Israeli lobby. We've heard people say that it's the US Congress is owned by AIPAC, and the power of Israeli cultural hegemony, and portraying Israel as the good guys and the Palestinians as terrorists, and those are all, you know, they're true on the in various, you know, to the extent that they're you know, to the extent that it matters. But I think that what I'm proposing to you is that um, foreign policy, US policy, Israeli policy is made by elites, and US elites are across the board, with a total consensus, they're all pro-Israel. So um, maybe in past rounds, there were some factions of the elite that were worried. We know this is true in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, that were worried about war with the Soviet Union. We know that concern is no longer there. So there's nobody in the US elite to say, hey, we've got to call Israel off because Soviet Union has these Arab allies and they're going to escalate to the nuclear threshold, or beyond, even if this war continues. So we need a ceasefire. So we don't have that anymore. There's no Soviet Union, and Russia, as I've argued, is fairly pro-Israel. And so while Russia and the US are fighting it out in Ukraine in a proxy war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people in the past 2 years, they both sort of agree on some of the main tenets of Israel's right to, you know, to do these things. They understand what Israel's doing, have a fairly common understanding of what Israel's doing as being within Israel's rights, and maybe there are excesses, but broadly kind of sympathetic to the Israeli position. So that's not there. There's no Russia Soviet threat that's gonna destabilize the situation. But that still doesn't explain 2006, 8, 9, all the wars of the 2000s, and why the US called those off. And the elite consensus in favor of Israel, the Western consensus in favor of Israel, has just become so deep. And the transformation of Israel itself, the removal of an Israeli dissent or dissenting voice that's somehow pro-Palestinian, means that there's a complete brick wall when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to political solutions, when it comes to diplomacy across the board in the West, US, Canada, France, Germany, etc. So that elite consensus means, you know, one of the implications of that elite consensus is the US is not going to make that call. The US is not going to make that phone call. There's no, if this president won't do it, then we'll find a president who will, using the tools of our democratic system. No, I don't think I'm afraid that's not how it works either. If this president doesn't do it, the next president also won't do it, is the system that we have in the US and Canada and elsewhere in the West. They're all, the opposition, the ruling party and the opposition are both pro-Israel unconditionally. So it's there are implications for what that for what activists should do if you're an activist oriented person in the West. But there are implications in terms of what constitutes a blind alley and what constitutes a dead end versus what constitutes something potentially productive. And we can talk about those, and I'm sure I will get back to those on this channel. But and I've talked about it on my Substack as well. But in analytical terms, I think it's important to let that go on this one. It's been 6 months, or we're on month 6. We're in tens of thousands of people dead. We're in a full starvation phase, and there's no crack in the Western consensus of support for Israel. No meaningful crack in the elite consensus. I mean, somebody making a speech at the Oscars, or the election of like one person like George Galloway or something, that doesn't constitute a crack in the consensus. So that's just what I wanted to say about that idea. That phone call, that cutoff of cargo, it's not going to be made, because the US and Israel have a common elite, and they don't, and that elite has a consensus on what Israel is doing right now. So there's no convincing some faction of that elite to take the reins of power and change the direction of this war. That I don't think is how this is going to be decided, which is also why these sit reps have focused on what's happening on the battlefield, because that's where I believe this is going to be decided. And I wish it wasn't the case, but it is what I think. Okay. So now that concludes the sit rep portion. So for those of you who are ready to log off with that, that's your fair warning, because we're going to go back now to 1970, and we're going to talk about how Jordan went from fighting the Israelis in the 1948 war and the 1967 war. The Jordanian forces were fighting against Israel in Jerusalem, to today being the place where the Palestinian Authority forces are trained, being the place where they're helping out with the land corridor, being the place that's suppressing pro-Palestine demonstrations, being the land corridor being the land corridor to Israel, to support Israeli logistics and economy while they commit this genocide. Where the king Abdullah is participating in this vile exercise of airdropping aid on top of Palestinians or into the sea. I think he was the first one who dropped it directly into the sea. How did that happen? Just like Egypt, and when we did that, when I did that sit rep on Egypt was the leader of the Arab states that were fighting Israel, the frontline states that were fighting Israel. And then it became the key ally in oppressing the Palestinians. And the other key ally in suppressing the Palestinians is Jordan. And how did that come to pass? Jordan and Egypt, if you understand, you have to understand Israel is as if you understand Israel as a consumer of United States military equipment, as a consumer of United States of United States diplomatic credit, as a consumer of Turkish and other Arab neighbors' food and other supplies and as a consumer of all of these things, and then understand Israel in terms of a network of alliances. Israel is a set of alliances, and the set of alliances facilitate the destruction of the Palestinians. And Egypt is the most important, but right behind is Jordan, very close behind is Jordan. And the turnaround of Jordan goes back to 1970. So this is a little bit of history about what was called Black September, September of 1970. And there's a number of sources that I used, but one of them that I highly recommend is Joseph Massad. I recommend anything and everything by Joseph Massad. If you go on the internet and you watch interviews with Joseph Massad, you could do very much worse in terms of spending your time. If you find a book by Joseph Massad, if you find an article by Joseph Massad, read it. Don't skip it. There are no exceptions to this rule. So, 19. So in the colonial period, so after World War One, the Arab world, the Arab world, which had all of these Arab countries today, they had belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was carved up after World War One, and the parts of it were given to the colonial powers. And Palestine was a mandate, a British colony, and the population of Palestine included a lot of people who lived in what's called the Transjordan. Why was it called Transjordan? Because it was both sides of the Jordan River, the west bank of the Jordan River, the east bank of the Jordan River. That constituted Transjordan. And the British had created a kingdom of Transjordan, and they had imported a king, King Hussein. They called him, from the Hashemite dynasty. And this is something they did all over the place, but they did it in Transjordan as well. They imported a king to rule over Transjordan. And that was the dispensation that they had set up. They were planning eventually to give Palestine to the Zionists. They had committed to that in the Balfour Declaration. They had also committed to independence and freedom and unity for the Arabs, but they had also always planned to betray that. I will be getting into all of that in my historical podcast. If you check that out, we're in the middle of World War One. We've done some episodes already on. We did one episode on the Sykes-Picot secret deal. We're going to be getting to the Balfour Declaration pretty soon, but we have the war, the Israeli war, the so-called Nakba, where Israel takes the land that's currently constitutes Israel, right? 1948 Israel, and that's when they ethnically cleanse hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Many of them end up in the Transjordan. They end up in the West Bank of Transjordan, and some of them are east of Jordan. And so there's a huge Palestinian population already, and then there's a huge refugee population that goes into Transjordan in 1948. Let's just a little note for those that are offended by From the River to the Sea. Chomsky's pointed out a long time ago that the Likud charter says, the West Bank is ours, and so is the East Bank. The Jordan River, that's ours, and so is the other side too. So in the greater Israel ambition, both sides of Jordan are supposed to belong to Israel. And not just the West Bank. So after 1948, there's a United Nations Resolution 181, which had included the West Bank of Transjordan as part of the Palestinian state, right? It was supposed to, if you look at a map of the partition, maybe I can show it to you, 181 map. Maybe I can pull up a 181. Resolution 181. So this is what it was supposed to look like. Trying to find a nice big one for you. So the Palestinian state was going to be all this orange. And as you may know, the occupied, the Gaza Strip is much smaller than this. The West Bank is much smaller than this. And of course, this north is all controlled by Israel. But this was the partition plan by the United Nations for partitioning the land into two states. Israel took much more than this in 1948, and then they proceeded to occupy the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. So after 1967, when, like I said, Jordan had actually fought on the side of the other Arab states, they'd fought alongside Egypt and Syria. They'd fought the Israelis, and like the other Arab states, they lost as well. Then that was the end of the 1967 war was the beginning of the Palestinian guerrilla struggle, right? So the 1960s, there's guerrilla movements, there's the Vietnamese, there's Latin American guerrillas, African guerrilla movements for independence, and then afterwards. So guerrilla movements all over, and the Arab world is no exception, and they were fighting out of the West Bank. There was on the East Bank, because Israel had occupied the West Bank, the guerrillas, the Fatah faction, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all these Palestinian groups, they're setting up in Jordan. They're setting up in the east side. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which kind of is the umbrella of all of these groups, they set up in Karame, a town just east of the Jordan River in Jordan. And the guerrilla struggle, they conduct raids into Israel and the West Bank, and Israel responds with disproportionate colonial destruction. So they conduct massive reprisal against Jordan, which causes the king of Jordan, King Hussein, a lot of stress because he feels like the guerrillas are basically bringing the wrath of Israel down on his country. In 1968, Israel attacked the town of Karame, which was the Palestinian Liberation Organization's kind of one of their strongholds, and they killed 200 people, or there's 200 casualties anyway from the PLO. But Israel also takes 30 casualties from this from this lightly armed guerrilla force. As a result, the PLO gained a lot of prestige, and the post-1967 glow from Israel also comes off a little bit. So this is a demonstration of the power of guerrilla action that the PLO takes a lot of inspiration from. So the growing power of the PLO and the growing prestige, but also the power. They're armed. They're training all over the Arab world. They're getting funds. They're setting up almost like their own structures in Jordan, and that creates a dilemma for King Hussein. There are armed clashes between King Hussein's troops and the guerrillas, and he tries to rein them in, arrest leaders, punish them for attacking Israel. He's trying to do a thing where he's saying, telling Israel, don't attack Jordan. I will deal with these people. I'll crush them for you, right? And he said in 1968, there's a quote from King Hussein saying, Jordanian authorities will strike with an iron fist all elements who, through their actions, provide Israel with a pretext to apply pressure on Jordan. So there's fighting between the Palestinian guerrillas and the armed forces of King Hussein in Jordan. There's various fights and various deals. There's what's called the 7-point agreement in November 1968, when the PLO agrees that they're not going to challenge Jordanian sovereignty. And King Hussein, give him credit. He goes to the Americans and he says, look, this is a problem for me. The PLO guerrillas are a problem for me. What if we end the occupation of the West Bank and then they get the state that they've been promised all this time? How about that? And the Americans, of course, laugh in his face, right? So that's not happening. So then King Hussein decides instead that he has to crush the PLO. By February 1970, there's more fighting, clashing again. And this is when King Hussein goes to the Israelis and says, listen, I've got a whole bunch of troops stationed at the border with the West Bank. And if I withdraw these forces and use them to crush the Palestinian guerrillas, are you going to take advantage? Are you going to occupy Jordan or part of Jordan, and take advantage of the fact that I'm crushing Palestinian guerrillas? And Israel says, no, go ahead and crush the PLO. We'll benefit from that too. So with Israel's blessing, King Hussein has one other problem, which is that the army is majority Palestinian, maybe. Some sources that I read said that King Hussein estimated that the army was 60% Palestinian origin. Joseph Massad thinks that it was more like 45%. And in some key infantry units, it was between 15 and 20%. So not the majority, maybe. The other group, besides Palestinians, are British trained Bedouin origin soldiers. So in addition to having a kind of division in his army, so he has these Bedouin units that he can count on to fight against the Palestinians. He doesn't know for sure what the Palestinian background soldiers, what they're going to do if he orders them to crush the PLO. But then there's other issues. So the Palestinians are divided in the PLO is the PLO, but there are many divisions, there are many factions within the PLO. They also are conducting their work with some abuses. They're extorting. And Joseph Massad says what another weakness is the Palestinian nationalism of the guerrillas, who ignored Transjordanians in their mobilization campaigns and gave credence to regime claims borne out by PFLP slogans, for example, that guerrillas wanted to turn Jordan into a Palestinian state. So in August of 1969, the King Hussein's government had ordered the creation of a new army made up of so-called Transjordanians, not Palestinians, and limited recruitment to the East Bank. So that he called that the Popular Army, and mobilizing the Bedouin. Bedouin are like kind of like tribal people, I guess. So he mobilizes the Bedouin tribes. He holds a series of tribal conferences, including one in February 1970, where 200 tribal leaders demanded that the king strike with an iron fist those who defy Jordanian law, and assured him of their total support for the application of the laws of the state. In June 1970, the Palestinian guerrillas attacked the police intelligence headquarters, the Mukhabarat headquarters, and they attacked King Hussein's motorcade. The Bedouin units of the king responded by immediately shelling 2 refugee camps and killing hundreds of people, mostly civilians. The refugee camps were Al-Wahdat and Al-Hussein. So here we have the Jordanian army attacking civilians, refugees in refugee camps, as a reprisal for attacks by guerrillas on police and military targets. Where have you seen that before? So there's a temporary ceasefire again, but then shortly after that, in the summer, the PFLP take over some hotels and they hold Western hostages, and they demand the king dissolve the government, which the king does. So the hostages are freed, and he appoints a pro-Palestinian army general and a Palestinian prime minister. So he changes by taking hostages, they managed to convince the king to change the government, to dissolve the government. So negotiations continue between Israel and Egypt after the 1967 war, and they finally end in an armistice in 1970, which the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, does not like. He feels that the armistice was a betrayal. So things are coming to a head at the end of the summer. And in September 1970, on September 4th, there's another tribal conference in Ma'an, and the tribal conference concludes that the Palestinian guerrillas, the Fedayeen, must be evicted from the south of the country. And Massad notes that following most of these conferences, these tribal conferences, Bedouin forces would attack the offices of the guerrilla organizations and attack individual Palestinians. So again, each of these tribal conferences also brings matters to a head. And then on September 6th, 1970, there's airplane hijackings, major airplane hijackings of 3 airliners. The planes are diverted to Dawson Field Airport in Jordan. The hijackers rename it, these are Palestinian hijackers, they rename it Revolution Airport, and they hold a press conference on September 7th demanding their own political prisoners in exchange for the hostages they took on the airlines. In response, the United States sends their Navy to the Mediterranean and a bunch of warplanes, but Britain kind of wavers and they end up negotiating for their own hostages. They release Palestinian prisoners that they're holding in exchange for British hostages. Makes the Israelis and the Americans very mad. On September 10th, the PFLP takes over the Intercontinental Hotel in Amman, and there's fighting against Jordanian military and police on that day, all around the hotel and maybe even inside the hotel. The United Nations adopts a resolution 286, simply calling for the release of all hostages. It doesn't have any effect, essentially. September 12th, the hijackers do release 300 plus hostages, and they keep 54 of them. And then they arrange the planes for the cameras and blow up the empty planes. On September 5th, King Hussein dissolves the pro-Palestinian government, tells the guerrillas, the Fedayeen, to disarm and leave. They refuse. And then he declares martial law. And this is when the actual fighting of Black September really begins. There's 2 weeks of fighting starting now. September 17th, the Jordanian armor attacks these 2 major refugee camps that they'd shelled months before, Wahdat and Hussein. There's major bombardment. And the king's troops simultaneously attack the Fedayeen in Irbid, Jerash, Al-Salt, Zarqa, and Amman. There's fighting in the streets, and the Jordanian forces get the upper hand. They push the Fedayeen, in some cases, into Libya, across the border into Syria, and even across the West Bank, across the river into the West Bank, where they surrender to Israel. There's one little interesting anecdote for people who follow, for example, the series that I did on this channel around Pakistan and the overthrow of Imran Khan and Pakistani politics. There was a brigadier, a Pakistani brigadier, that was involved in training exercises with Jordanian units when the war broke out. Brigadier's name, just in case you are interested, is Zia-ul Haq. Look that up. Iraq, then the 2 Arab nationalist neighbors, Iraq and Syria, they actually intervene to save the Palestinian guerrillas. So Iraq sends 100 tanks and 17,000 men over the border into Jordan. Syria sends 300 tanks, 60 artillery pieces, and 16,000 troops into northern Jordan on September 20th. But then, immediately after crossing the border, the Syrian and Iraqi troops just kind of stop. So they don't do anything. America moves its naval assets just off the coast of Lebanon. Israel assembles 200 tanks and starts to do flyovers over the Syrian units in Jordan. And then the Jordanian Air Force launches 250 airstrikes over the 2 weeks on Syrian positions, or 1 week at this point. Syria then turns back and returns to Syrian territory. Oh, it wasn't a week. It was just a couple of days from September 22nd. King Hussein formally thanks America and Israel for spooking Syria and Iraq. So they were spooked and they decided to cancel their intervention. One of the sources that I read said that 300 Jordanian troops defected to the Palestinian guerrilla side, but Joseph Massad says 5,000 deserted to the resistance over the course of September. The chief of staff of the Jordanian military, Mashhur Haditha al-Jazi, was resigned and was placed under house arrest, fearing that he was sympathetic to the guerrillas. Jordanian officer Bahjat al-Muhaysin from Tafila was convicted for disobeying orders to shoot Palestinians in Irbid. So there were heavy casualties for the Fedayeen. Major Palestinian guerrilla commanders were captured and killed. So at the Arab League summit, there was an Arab League summit on September 27th, and that's when Egyptian President Nasser forced Arafat and King Hussein to sign a ceasefire. But the PFLP and the DFLP, some of the factions don't sign, and they continue to fight on until they're finally basically crushed. So Arafat claimed afterwards that Black September claimed 25,000 deaths. King Hussein would say that there were 2,500 and 537 Jordanian military deaths. Massad's conclusion, or his roundup, is as follows. He says, the 2-week fighting that began in mid-September killed thousands and destroyed large sections of Jordanian cities, especially the capital Amman, in the process. Although the government and King Hussein insisted that the death toll was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000, the guerrillas and foreign journalists reported that it was much higher, between 7,000 and 20,000 people, some of whom were said to have been buried in mass graves by the Jordanian army. Hussein's prime minister, Mohammed Daoud, defected to Libya during the Arab summit. So Hussein had to go himself, and everybody was, very disdainful of King Hussein. Nasser, the Egyptian president, died just after the ceasefire signed, and Ahmed Sadat eventually took over. So we know how that went from the previous sitrep. The Amman Agreement of October 13th was a major the Palestinian guerrillas accepted a major curtailing of their activity. They're not allowed to bear arms, they're not allowed uniforms, no forces in towns and villages. And Jordan, but in return, what they got was that Jordan agreed that the PLO was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But crushing the remaining factions happens in 1971, the final assault by Jordan in Jerash and Al-Jun in the north. That's when they were finally forced out and they set up in Lebanon. You've heard about how that went in the sitrep that includes a discussion on Syria. So Jordan destroys, so here's a symbolic thing that they do. They destroy, the Palestinian Fedayeen had erected a monument in October 21st, 1970, to commemorate Black September. They called it the Tomb of the Unknown Martyr. And the Jordanian forces of King Hussein destroyed that monument on May 31st, 1971. So they didn't allow that kind of commemoration of something that they had done. And then a Palestinian group called Black September, this is the epilogue, I guess, Palestinian group called Black September Organization. They assassinated the Jordanian Prime Minister, Wasfi al-Tal, in Cairo in November 1971. The PLO is forced out of Jordan altogether, moves to Lebanon, and King Hussein dies in 1999, and the throne goes to King Abdullah, who does all the airdrops and all the other normalization and cooperation with Israel that we have seen. So wanted to tell you the story of Black September, tell you the story of how Jordan came to be part of the reliable system of alliances that Israel counts on to bolster its, to isolate the Palestinians. And that is another plank of Israel's power, another ally that underlies Israel's power that I don't know. I don't see changing anytime soon, and I think we've got some sense of why. Similarly to Egypt and Jordan have joined the Western camp. They understand the Western camp as guaranteeing their rule and leaving them to do their thing as long as they don't interfere with Israel and what it's doing to the Palestinians. All right, I will leave it there. And we will please like and subscribe. And we will see you in the next sit rep. So as I have several other dives upcoming. I'm going to talk about nonviolence. I'm going to talk about the Great March of Return of 2018. In that context, I'm going to talk about the War of 1948. I think I mentioned I was going to do that using Ilan Pappes and Rashid Khalidi's books. So I've got a few things that I'll do with deep dives, but meanwhile, the sit reps will continue. All right, stay strong, hold on, hang in there, like and subscribe and all that stuff, and I will see you next time.